Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome in. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. We'll give a couple of seconds for the meeting to fill up and folks can start to access the resources, and we'll get started really soon. Thanks for being here with us today.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I think I see folks joining and slowing down a bit, so I'll go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone. I am so glad that you're here to join us live. If you decide later on to use this webinar as an asynchronous resource, I'm glad you're here too. So my name is Brenda Green. I am an implementation specialist at CAST. And today along with Leah Blake, we will be covering a lesson design workshop under the lens of UDL. So if you haven't already, either follow the QR code or the bit.ly link. That's going to take you to a Google Doc, which contains a link to this presentation. So feel free to make a copy and take your own notes, as well as some other resources that we've captured throughout the presentation that you can go back to at a later time. Okay. So CCIL leadership is made possible by the partnership with CDE as well as CCEE. And the grantee of the CCIL project is Placer County Office of Education. Our partners in this work, we have Fresno County Superintendents of Schools and the following county offices: Los Angeles, San Joaquin, Santa Clara, Sonoma, and 2 GeoLeads, Valley to Coast Collaborative, and Capital Central Foothill Area Consortium. So as I just mentioned before, my name is Brenda Green, and I am an implementation specialist at CAST. And joining me today is my colleague Leah, and I'll have her introduce herself.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Leah Blake. I am a coordinator with Kern County Superintendent of Schools and the Geo Lead for the Valley to Coast region, doing the UDL work, and I'm glad to be here with you guys today.
All right, so just to make this webinar more interactive and engaging, we want to invite you to introduce yourself in the chat, ask or answer a question, as well as share any ideas or resources that you might find helpful today. And of course, any hyperlinks as well. And as always, if you want to communicate with anyone in particular, at their name, right? And then of course you have the ability to talk to all of us at once and individually, participants individually. And I should say that this is a meeting format. So in the past, we've done this as a webinar. So we are in a meeting space. So just keep that in mind as well. So hopefully you have had a chance to follow the link. If not, it's on the bottom left and it'll take you to this page here. So if you want to take notes within the presentation, you have the webinar slides there. And then of course, the following resources as well. All right, so today's goals today, it's quite ambitious for an hour, but I think we'll have some fun and we'll be able to get it started, right? At least start this conversation and provide you with some resources, but we want to apply the UDL design process to design or redesign your lessons. And then the other goal is to understand how to use the UDL guidelines to design options that minimize barriers to learning and respond to variability. So I'm going to pause just for a second. And if you would, in the chat, what might be your personal goal for today, right? If you have one, please put one there, or if not, you can write it on your own notes. I'm just gonna invite you to do so if you'd like. Okay, and I'll give you a moment to do that, and then I will try to see what you'll put. All right, so we're going to go ahead and continue. Hopefully that was a healthy pause. But I will lift up just this idea of just continuing on with learning more about the design options. I see, Anya, your goal there based on the expanded guidelines. All right, so moving on. So before we get started, I want to give you, so you have your goal. Hopefully you have one in mind, a personal goal. But because we are doing a lesson design, I want you to think about, and again, you can put it in the chat or write it to yourself or just have it internal to yourself. Share a lesson design barrier or challenge that you hope to minimize as you learn more about UDL. Or you have the option of sharing a lesson design experience or resource that resonated well with, it should be your learners or with learners. So if you can think about that for a second, just as we're going through this presentation, just having that in the back of your head. All right, so just to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of UDL, there are our UDL foundational principles. So the barrier is in the design, not the learner. Variability is the norm. It is contextual and it can be planned for. And then of course, the goal of UDL is learner agency. And because we are going to talk about the lesson design process, let's take a look at the UDL design process here, which is to set clear, rigorous goals, anticipate variability, and then of course, design options to minimize barriers. Okay, so thinking about barriers that may exist, and again, we're covering over on lesson design. There are, of course, our goals, and then we have these 4 design areas. So we're going to take you through, me and Leah, each of these parts as we consider how we're going to design or redesign our lesson. So if we're thinking about barriers within our design, this is what we're looking at. Our goals: what will guide instruction, minimize barriers to learning, motivate students, and foster learner agency. And then of course, these materials. So some key questions to ask, right? How is the content being represented? Methods: how is the content being delivered? Assessment: how is the learning being demonstrated? And then of course, environment: how is the climate and culture supportive of the learning? In terms of variability, we know that students vary, right, by their interests, effort, and resilience and emotional well-being. So this is connected to engagement. So if you have the UDL guidelines in front of you, this is the variability that would exist in terms of engagement. And then if we look at the next piece, students vary in terms of how they perceive content, language, and background knowledge. So that center part of the UDL guidelines, representation, this is what that is connected to. And then of course, students vary in how they navigate their environment, communication skills, and then executive function skills. And this is connected to action and expression. Okay. Something new to the guidelines as of July 30th is this idea of identity as part of variability. So along with what you just mentioned before, so the variability that you saw on the previous slide is connected to the research we know about the brain, right? This here around identity, we're now, as part of the revision, looking at students that are entering our spaces, they come with their own identity. So you can see this identity wheel. You see several things here, and we know this is not exhaustive, and it may be even overwhelming. But if we think about it as, you know, in terms of cultures either lie, they're more likely collectivistic in nature or individualistic in nature, right? So if we're thinking about a way of responding to identity that may exist in our classroom space, then providing options either collectivistic, so meaning the group relies on the collective wisdom, right, or the resources. And of course, in individualistic cultures, the belief is that one learns on their own. If we think about options that hit across both, then we will likely be able to attend to identities, most of the identities that exist in our class. And of course, both as well, right? We may have individuals that come into our spaces where they're operating in both ways, right? All right, so the UDL guidelines, there is a link if you need to access this. And if someone can put it in the chat, that would be great. If you need to reference this as we're going through, just as a reminder, the UDL guidelines, this is the tool that you will look to when you're redesigning or designing your lessons. So this provides you your guidance that you would need. Just a few things just to process this, because it could look very overwhelming, right? If you look across this, there's 9 guidelines, there's 35 design considerations. So if this is new to you, if this is the first time you've seen this, the way you could think about processing this, you see the 3 roles here, right? And then of course you see the 3 principles here: engagement, representation, action, and expression. So one way to look at it is if you think as a educator, you're having, if there's like barriers to engagement, right? But you need to increase access, right? So you would look to this guidance here, right? Likewise, if you're having barriers to representation and access is an issue, then this is where you would look to help you with options that you would provide into your lesson and so forth. And the same thing applies here. If you're thinking you need to provide additional support within your lesson design, you will look across this role, of course, and then if you need to support executive function within your design, then you will look across this role here, okay? All right, so just to get you acclimated to this, I want to play a UDL guidelines game, so I'm hoping you'll want to play with me. And so here's what we're going to do, and I've also linked this game as well in the deck, as well as on the Google Doc that you followed earlier on when you joined. The directions are also within that deck as well, how to play. So essentially what's going to happen is I'm going to put up a challenge that we might be facing as an educator, and then you're going to choose one of those guidelines that I put up. So you saw the guidelines at a glance, right? But we're going to have specific ones, and you're going to choose one of them that you think would best meet that challenge, and then of course make the case for it. So if we were in person, we could have dialogue back and forth about it. But in this format, feel free to write in the chat your choice. So here we go. So here's our very first challenge. Most of my students are not able to sustain their work, especially if they encounter something hard. So this challenge hopefully is familiar to us all. So what I would like for you to do is I want you to look at the 4 options on the screen. So the first one, you have the guideline, expression, and communication. And your option here to consider is use multiple media for communication. So that's number 1. So you can put, if you're going to add in the chat, the number 1, if that's the one you think is going to best meet this challenge, and then a quick blurb on your justification. The second one, sustaining effort and persistence. So offer action-oriented feedback, number 2. The third is welcoming interests and identities, and that's optimize relevance, value, and authenticity. And the fourth is a wild card. So you can choose any of the considerations that are on the guideline to support this challenge. So I'll give you a second to think that through, and then we'll see. I'm eager to see what we come up with in the chat. So I love that, Yvette. Feedback is very important. So Sham is saying if we are using content that is relevant and meaningful to our learners, they may be better able to sustain effort when things get hard. Yep. All right. So it looks like most of us picked number 2. But I want to make sure that you understand that there is no wrong answer here, right? In a moment, I'm going to talk about setting goals, right? And so once we get clear on our goals, and of course, the options we want to provide for students, then you'll begin figuring out which one, right, which option you would want to include within your design, right? But there's, we don't have a goal necessarily in front of us, right? A lesson goal in mind. We're just looking at this challenge blindly, right? Okay. But it looks like two is a fan favorite. And I don't think anyone picked from the wild card, right? We all stuck with 1, 2, or 3. Okay. Looking down at the chat. Yes. All right. Well, let's try to do a couple more rounds because I want to make sure you guys are, clear on how to at least begin to use the UDL guidelines as a tool when you're designing your lesson. So let's look at challenge number 2. All right. So many students are not very good at managing their time. Many students are not very good at managing their time. So here are the options. Okay, so we have guideline language and symbols. Option, support decoding of text, mathematical notation and symbols, number 1. Number 2, welcoming interests and identities. So nurture joy and play. Number 3, expression and communication. So we want to address biases as an option related to modes of expression and communication. And then of course, building knowledge, maximize transfer and generalization, number 4. So what are you guys thinking here? What option can we lean into to help kids with managing their time? Any others? 2. All right, so I see a good mix here, right? And again, we don't have a goal in front of us, right? So I could easily, we had someone pick 3, right, addresses biases related to modes of expression and communication, right? Because this, if a student may not know how to, express the way in which, express what they've learned, right? Or, other things going on there that could hold them back, right? Perhaps. We have 2, nurture joy and play. And it looks like a few of us are leaning into 4, maximize transfer and generalization, right? So just understanding how can I take what I know now and move it forward, right? And just start looking at generalizing what I am learning about.
Brenda, I wanted to point out too that we did have somebody point out they want to use a combo of 3 and 4. And I love that because sometimes there isn't just one answer and one guideline that we might need to address the barriers.
Exactly. And so I thank you for sharing that, Leah, because I don't want to ever convey that as we are designing our lessons, we're just looking to one option at a time. This game is just forcing like an option you really probably wouldn't consider, right? Because typically when I play this game with participants, they get random cards, right? And so the options are given to them randomly and they just have to really think through what would work, right? But obviously, when you're doing your lesson design, you want to include as many options as possible and make them available to all learners, right? So that, in the spirit of UDL, that's what we want to capture, right? Because the more options we have, that supports the variability across the learners within our lesson, the more success we'll have. So we have a rebel here, 3 and 4, breaking rules. I love it. All right. Any others before we have one more challenge? Okay. All right, so last challenge, students are not using skills and strategies taught in writing mini lessons independently across context. Okay, so you have 4 options: emotional capacity, the guideline, and then the option here, excuse me, is promote individual and collective reflection. Number 1, you have strategy development, second guideline here, and then option organize information and resources. Option number 3, expression and communication, and then build fluency with graduated support for practice and performance. And then of course, building knowledge, our last guideline here, and the option highlight and explore patterns, critical features, big ideas, and relationships. So I'll give you a second to decide which one you think could work. All right, so I see 2, 4, 2 and 4, 3, 2, and then we have, this is a good one. I think all of these could apply, and I agree, Shamron. 2 and 4, and then we have a combo of 2 and 4. All right. All right, so I think that we are getting the point here that, you know, the UDL guidelines, it's, you know, very robust. There's lots of options. And again, depending on the goal, you could, you know, look at all of these options being options to support your lesson design. All right, so let's go ahead and move. I want to go ahead and jump into the next piece here. So thank you for playing with me. We're going to get into what we came here for, which is the lesson design using the UDL framework. Before we do that, I would like for us to look at this video. This is a great video. I think Shelly Moore is becoming popular, but if you haven't heard of Shelly Moore, she provides a lot of videos and gets us thinking about how we reimagine inclusive education. So if we, as we're looking at this video, what I'd like for you to do is to think about the relationship between bowling and UDL and how this might change your approach to lesson design. Okay, and then we'll discuss afterwards. And feel free to put any reactions in the chat as you're watching it as well. Here we go.
Hi, my name is Shelly Moore, and I'm a third-year PhD student at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. As Canadians, we have a reputation for finding and embracing the strength in our diversity. This value, however, hasn't been reflected in our classrooms, which still segregate students by ability, especially students with developmental disabilities. There's a gap in our understanding about what we know inclusive education to be, philosophically, versus what we understand and the importance of understanding inclusion in our practice. This is the question I'm trying to answer in my research, is how can we find the value in the day-to-day practice in our classrooms in terms of inclusive education? So how am I gonna explain this to you? Now I can sit here and try and describe this, or we could have a little bit more fun. Why don't we go bowling? So let's talk about bowling. You have 10 pins, you have 2 balls, and you have a lane. The goal is to knock down as many pins as you can. But if you don't get them all, it's okay because you have another chance. But when I bowl and roll the ball down the middle and I don't knock them all down, What often ends up happening to me is that there's 2 pins left standing on either end, and they stare at you. It's the 7-10 split, and it's the hardest shot in bowling. How is bowling like teaching? The ball was the lesson, the pins are the kids. We aim for the middle, we do the best we can. The pins that are left standing, we often have another chance to kind of get to them, but at the end of the day, those 2 pins that are staring, looking at you, are kids who need the most support and are kids who need the most challenge. So we end up choosing one, and the other one is left standing. I just took all the fun out of bowling. Now, I don't know how many times you've watched professional bowling, but I spent an afternoon watching professional bowling, and let me tell you, there was not one bowler who rolled that ball down the middle of the lane. They throw the ball down the lane at a curve. And I was actually really curious about this, so I called up a professional bowler. He was so excited. I don't think he gets a lot of calls about education. He said the reason why the ball has to enter at a curve is because you will knock down more pins and create a bigger domino effect if you enter at that angle. But in order to do that, you have to change your aim. In order to knock down the most pins with one shot, he aims for the pins that are the hardest to hit. Now let's just let this sink in for a second. We are taught to teach the head pins. We are not taught to teach to the kids who are the furthest and the hardest to get to, the kids with autism, the kids with Down syndrome. The part that's critical here, and it really aligns with universal design for learning, is that so often the supports that we design for those kids on the outside of the lane are actually supports that all of the kids need. This is the part we need to understand if inclusive education is going to move forward in Canada. How can we find this value of diversity in our classrooms between the students? This is not just important for the outside pins, but it's critical for every single one of us. And just think, all we need to do is change our aim. Look how bowling changed education.
All right, so if you can take a second to react to this in the chat, I would like to share my initial reactions when I first saw this video as well as you're doing that. I know that when I started education, many of my students were foster youth. I had multilingual learners and everything in between. And so this idea of, you know, the supports that I offered my students that needed more support as a way to support all of my students I never made that connection, you know, because I didn't have UDL, and in part because, of course, differentiation, excuse me, was more the emphasis when I was coming through pre-service programs, right? So we never really talked about, you know, all of the support you offer students, offer them to everyone. It could help someone and you never know, right? Leah, I don't know what your reactions were initially when you saw this, but.
Mine was more emotional. I have 2 children that are both neurodivergent and both need very different supports, and they are those end pins. And when I think about designing with them in mind, it really hit home on an emotional level and something I've been fighting for many, many years. And that just put it into a new perspective for me. So I love me some Shelley Moore.
I love her as well. I can't ever get enough of seeing her videos. All right. Well, let's see what's in the chat here. So we have Shamron design for the edges. What's necessary for some is good for all, right? Love that. And then Kelsey is saying, as a STC teacher, I completely agree. Many of the supports that I use for my students would work really well for the general ed classes as well. So love that as well, right? So we never, for whatever reason, we never think about again, the supports that we would offer, you know, students that, like, whether they're special ed students or just any student that require particular supports, I'll say, right? We never think about just offering it to all students, right? We make assumptions about what we think our learners need and we hold back those options. So I'm hoping that, you know, as we go through this webinar and as we think about the ways in which we use the UDL guidelines to design options, we begin stretching those supports across all of our learners instead of just our, you know, just particular learners. So we have another comment, but what's necessary for some can also become spoon feeding for the others. Okay, so again, we're going to talk a little bit about goals, right? And how we can begin looking at them in terms of UDL. So we would hope that, you know, if the goal is learner agency as students begin to pick particular options to support their learners. If we're finding they're not making the right choices, right? Or maybe the option is not in support of the goal, then we can figure out a way to rethink the content that shows up in our goals, or the skills or whatever it is that we're trying to accomplish with our learners. Okay, and then Chairman, there are very few supports that we should only offer to a few. Most of what we use is good for everyone. I agree. Even better is supporting the learners and choosing what is best for them. Yep. So again, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the goal of UDL is learner agency, right? So we should always be thinking, what are the ways in which, one, we can structure our goal, right, in alignment to just the overall goal of supporting learner agency, but also, again, making sure that kids are learning about themselves as learners in terms of how they move about the content, right? So very important. All right. And then Anya, yes, love the emphasis on learner agency. Double heart that. All right, so let's go ahead and move. All right. All right, so if you want to look at this lesson design guide, me and Leah, what we're going to attempt to do is cover the components of the lesson design guide. So if you click where it says digital copy, it's going to force you to make a copy of the design guide. So this is just a guide that's going to help you with each part of what we're going to cover today. There's also a lesson design protocol that you can use, like if you're holding a planning session or you're planning on your own, that you can also use, but we'll discuss the resources at the end of the presentation. All right. All right, so I mentioned this earlier before. These are the design areas that we're going to discuss. I'm going to go ahead and talk about goals, and then Leah's going to take us through the 4 design areas: materials, methods, assessment, and environment. And then again, we're going to share some resources, okay? So let's go ahead and start looking at goals in terms of UDL, right? What do you really want the learners to know, do, or care about, right? So starting with this cartoon here, I don't know if you all have seen this, but let's take a look at what's happening here, right? And feel free to react in the chat as well. So we have some students that are gathered around the entrance of a school, and there's snow, right, everywhere in front of the entrance. We have someone shoveling the snow, right? As part of that group of students, we also have a student in a wheelchair, okay? And so the student is asking, could you please shovel the ramp, right? And the one shoveling is saying, all these other kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling them off, then I will clear the ramp for you. And then another student is saying, but if you shovel the ramp, we can all get in, right? So that's what we want to hold. We want to hold that idea of, right, while the ramp is best for, it's the option that is perceived to be the best, right, for the student in the wheelchair, shoveling the ramp, right, everyone has access to that, right? So this is how we want to think about our goals, right? We want to give students an access point so that they are able to reach whatever the goal is, but also be in pursuit of learner agency, right? Get to know themselves as learners. All right, so here is a goal. Students will write a 5-paragraph essay on the life cycle of butterflies, right? So if we look at this goal here, what do we see here embedded in this goal, right? If we take a look here, we should see clearly there's 2 parts, right? So we see that we have a 5-paragraph essay, right? So it's a skill there. And of course, what the content kids are interacting with is the life cycle of butterflies, right? So if we're thinking about the goal in terms of UDL, then what you saw here, we should be thinking about it as 2 separate goals. And I'm going to explain why in a second. So if we were to restructure what we just saw as a content goal, students will demonstrate an understanding of the life cycle of butterflies. And then, of course, if we're looking at it in terms of skill, right, what skill students are doing, right? Students will write a 5-paragraph essay on a topic of their choice. So In terms of UDL, we want to make sure that the language is flexible, right? So that we are able to choose those options that we were just looking at earlier in the presentation to help support our lesson design, right? So looking back at the content goal, right? This allows us to be more flexible in the way in which students demonstrate that understanding, right? The way it was written previously, students had to show it through writing a 5-paragraph essay, right? But of course, in the spirit of UDL, we want to make sure kids are given the opportunity to show what they know, the way they believe they should do it, right? If we're looking at the skill, students will write a 5-paragraph essay on a topic of their choice, right? If we're just trying to assess or get an understanding of how kids are tracking toward that skill of writing a 5-paragraph essay, then students should be able to choose, for example, if you look at this choice board, a insect, right, that they could describe the life cycle for, right? And again, just assuming this is, and it is a life science class, right? This is totally appropriate, right, to do this, okay? So in terms of learner agency, so remember the goal of UDL is learner agency, right? You can see here, we can offer even more options by just providing just a life science choice board in general, right? And allow kids to pick, again, which activity that they could work toward as long as they're achieving the goal, okay? All right, so in terms of how we want to focus ourselves with writing UDL goals, right? The shift the focus to what we are learning rather than what we are doing, right? In terms of access, design options that remove barriers, and of course, ultimately in terms of agency, we want to empower learners to decide how to learn, okay? So just one thing before I pass it over to Leah, these are some questions that you can ask yourself. So you have your lesson design guidance that you followed earlier through that digital link. These are some more questions, and some of them might be aligned or similar to what you see on the guidance, but this is a few that I've lifted up here. One that I want to point out in particular that is important, the last one, have I considered my bias, right? This is a big change with the UDL guidelines. So this is huge in that, you know, again, as designers, we may have our designer bias, and we do have our designer bias, right? We may create a lesson that is based on how we learn best. But as we think about what students need, then we want to go ahead and step outside our bias. And the UDL guidelines will help us with doing that, because the options that you see there will get you to think differently about the options that you would provide for all students. Okay. All right, so I'm going to kick it over to Leah. She's going to take us through assessment next.
Thank you, Brenda.
You're welcome.
All right, so now that you guys have your clear and rigorous goal, the next step is to plan an assessment. And how are your students going to demonstrate what they know? And when you hear the word assessment, that doesn't mean like the big test at the end of the unit. This is ongoing assessment is all the time. So how are your students going to show what they've learned? And it's important to ask, is it aligned with the goal? And are there any barriers that are going to get in the way of your students demonstrating that? Can you click the next one for me? Thank you. All right, here's another cartoon. We love cartoons to illustrate our points. So assessments aligned with the goal and offer flexible options. So in this particular cartoon, there's a man behind the desk and says, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. And if you look at the participants there, there's, you know, maybe 2 that are going to be able to demonstrate that, while the other, 4 are completely left out and not able to participate. So it's important that all of our students are able to demonstrate their knowledge. Sorry, go ahead, Brenda. Thank you. All right, so we think about the assessment design process. First, we really need to make sure, again, that how is the assessment linked to the learning goal? Sometimes, again, like Brenda said, we design activities that are fun for us or how we learn, but is it in service of the goal that we've created? Second, it's important to think about what barriers might students experience. And this might vary from year to year. You're going to have different students every year, but you know your students and you know what barriers are going to pop up as the year goes on. And third, how does the assessment provide options for learners? All right, so assessment barriers, we want to reduce those by offering options, possibly co-create some assessments with our students, and we also want to check for accessibility. There's some examples here on the right. If a barrier is time limits, options might be providing flexible time limit for all learners. If the barrier is only one way to show your learning, maybe you can add some options, maybe allow for oral, have them record a video, or give them some other multimedia response as an option. If a barrier is unclear directions, perhaps scaffolding using visual supports and breaking down directions would be helpful for your students to remove those barriers. And the last one is if there's limited feedback, options are scheduling regular and specific times, specific feedback to support your students in the understanding of the assessment. All right, so just like with the goals, there are some key questions for you guys, just reflective questions to consider when you are designing an assessment for your lesson. Is it aligned to the goal? How will achievement be measured at the end of the lesson? Are there options? Again, are the assessment materials and tools accessible for all learners? Is there a availability for them to monitor their own progress? That's huge. How will they reflect on their own learning? Having those reflective conversations, giving them time to reflect, and how can they co-design the assessment with you? Some things to consider as you're designing assessments. All right, the next, remember there were 4 boxes. There was methods, materials, assessment, environment. Methods and materials go hand in hand, so we're presenting these together. So are the materials accessible for all of our learners? And do learners have the agency to choose their pathway towards the goal? And to demonstrate that, we want to design variability for all learners. Again, using animals, here's 4 animals in front of a one-size-fits-all store. Obviously, that's not going to work for this particular group. And just like our curriculum, it is a lot of times created as a one-size-fits-all, but it doesn't fit all of our students. And we really need to take some time to figure out what those barriers are and how we can provide options for our students to demonstrate their understanding. So providing materials and tools, what we've said several times in this training, what's necessary for some can be beneficial to all. When we provide a range of materials and tools, we increase access and agency for all students. So when you're designing your lesson, material is anything that we're using to present the lesson. So what options do you have for readings or texts that you're using? Do you have videos available that will support the learning? Is there an option for audio? Can they have a text to speech? Read that text to them. Do you have manipulatives available? Do you have any digital tools, online platforms? Those are all things you can consider as you're designing your lesson. Maybe some students do a lot better with digital platforms, and having them use that as opposed to just a paper reading text might be beneficial. When you're thinking about instructional methods, that's how you're presenting. Are you just lecturing? Have you incorporated discussion into your lesson? Are they just doing reading? Is there time for investigations or inquiry? And again, thinking about what online platforms could remove some barriers and help your students throughout the lesson. And some key questions here for our methods. So that's what are we providing with the students with? Where in the design are there multiple entry and access points for learning? How does the design support for collaboration? How does the design honor the voices and agency of marginalized students? Again, thinking about that identity. How does design support students to set goals and create plans? And what options for receiving feedback are offered to students? So as you're designing your methods, thinking about these questions and what are you able to provide for students? And then same thing for materials, just some considerations. Are they accessible for all students? And nowadays, a lot of our texts that we have also have that online platform, and they do have digital access and read alouds and things that are available for all students. How do the materials provide ways for all students to have access and engage? We want to see that engagement. Do the materials provide all learners with access to perceive and comprehend information? How do the materials provide all learners with access to build skills and make meaning? And how do the materials support all learners to have the agency to express understanding? And then thinking what scaffolds may be needed to support all of our learners. So we talked about chunking directions or different ways to support them, maybe offering a choice of texts, thinking about what materials you might have available. All right, so we talked about the assessment, the methods, materials, and now you want to think about your learning environment, and you want to make sure you create a space for all of your learners. How can the environment be designed to support learner agency? And this is a cartoon that a lot of you might be familiar with. I've seen this before as well, but creating an accessible environment with predictable options to support student agency and access. And this has a little wilted flower in the snow. And it says, when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. Me personally, I do not have a green thumb, so I couldn't fix a flower if I tried, but thinking about our students, the environment that they're in is very important, and we want to make sure that they're thriving.
Leah, I want to add to this cartoon, because what it makes me think about, again, as I shared earlier, when I started teaching, I had a lot of different scenarios happening in my classroom in terms of the level of support students needed. And so while I didn't have UDL in front of me, I remember, when I taught Algebra 1, I'm a former high school math teacher. I started my career as a high school math teacher. Many of my students would come to me lacking basic, multiplication skills or things that, I couldn't necessarily change like right away, right? So then what are the ways in which I could support these students? And I just remember way back then, early 2000s, right? This idea of using calculators in a math class just was the department was always split. So, but for me, it was about more or less creating an environment so that kids felt like they could have access to the algebra. And so if it meant me providing a calculator as an option to get them to the content, even though our system hadn't caught up with that idea, those are the things that I did. And so I want to make sure, as we're thinking about UDL, think about some of those options that, they may not necessarily be popular or fancy, but if you're thinking about the goal and the environment that you're creating for your learners, then, that's how you want to be thinking about like getting kids, definitely access, but getting them to that point where they feel powerful and hopeful that they can take on the learning in your classroom.
Absolutely, Brenda. Thank you. And one thing that I have noticed a lot lately since being in the UDL work is being in classrooms and noticing when students have agency to choose where they're sitting, who they're working with, that engagement increases tenfold. If they want to sit on the floor, like anywhere can be a working space for students with a clipboard or a book to write on. And the engagement is phenomenal just with that little bit of agency, and it's a simple fix where it's time for you to work. Go ahead and choose where you want to sit. Kind of easy option. Not the most popular, just like the calculators, but
yeah,
when you come in and see kids all over the floor, but when they're engaged, it's a beautiful, beautiful thing.
And toward the end of my career, online calculators happened. So now it became about how do we manage cell phone access, but still giving students access to an online calculator so they can do the analysis or whatever they needed, right? So options are way more robust now than they were before. So hopefully, more and more educators are thinking again, and of course, this is the heart of our work, right? thinking about those options to support their environment.
Yes.
All right. Moving on.
All right, so when you are designing your learning environment, just consider the barrier is in the environment, not in the learner. When we design environments that scaffold and support all learners, we increase student agency to select their learning path. So take a minute to reflect on your learning environment. How does the environment support your goals? There's some reflective questions here. How can the learning environment reinforce a collaborative culture focused on supporting mastery of learning goals and the development of learning expertise? And then also, what predictable options in the environment can support representing content by supporting language or symbols and themes or big ideas in the curriculum? So think anchor charts, word walls, things that are predictable your students know they can count on. So if you guys want to take just a minute, if there's anything that you would like to share about your own learning environment, something that works for you, we'd love to hear some things you already have in place. You guys can learn from each other. Is there anything that you guys do that reinforces that collaborative culture? Do you guys have any predictable options? Just go ahead and drop some in the chat, and we'd love to hear from you. If you guys think of anything, please feel free to drop it in. We'll go ahead and continue. We only have a few minutes left with you guys. Some choices that are predictable. So if you think about your goal, my teacher always makes the goal clear, provides scaffolding to achieve the goal with feedback and reflection along the way. So students knowing that whatever their goals are, it's going to be clear to them. Some examples for materials. Maybe the teacher always has digital and paper copies of graphic organizers, so they have an option. Same assignment, just different ways to access it. With the methods, maybe your predictable option is that you always have options and gives you the agency to decide. For assessment, my teacher always has options to show my understanding. Again, if we're asking them to write every time, we're going to miss out on a lot of what our students know for our struggling writers and students who may not be able to access that modality. And in an environment, my teacher always gives me the agency to choose the tools I need to be successful. So those are some examples of predictable choices that you could have in your classroom. All right, and then Brenda, did you want to go over the resources?
Yeah, so I want to jump back in. Thank you, Leah. So just a few resources after this webinar that you can access. So you have the lesson design guide, which is what me and Leah try to just have you go through, right? Just have an understanding of each of the parts. So if you're looking at it, you're going to see some guidance there on what to look for in each of those design areas that we discussed. And then the lesson plan protocol, you have that as well. The open access resource that I want to highlight that I just learned about, which is pretty neat, this learner variability navigator. So if you click onto it, you get to add some factors regarding your learners, and then it'll kick back some strategies that you could consider when designing your lesson. So very neat tool. The flip kit as well, you can filter a guideline and a design option, and then it'll give you some more suggestions as well in terms of lesson design. So I really want you guys to follow these links, when you get a chance, and see how that can support you with your lesson design or redesign, right? Because I'm sure, all of your lessons. There's some great ones there that you've done, right? Probably prior to UDL. And so now taking another look at it, now that you have the guidelines and a lesson plan protocol to consider when you're looking at your lesson or taking another look at your lesson, okay? So in the chat, as you reflect on the ideas that have been shared today, what has affirmed your thinking, pushed your thinking, what might your learners need you to do next, right? So if you can put that in the chat. And then actually, let me look at, I think do we have a question here? So we have a question here. I am curious about universally designed materials that work for educators working with visually impaired students and can follow up via email with you both. Okay, so that's just, okay, yeah, so if you could do that, that would be great. Thank you. Or if anyone has any ideas, please put in the chat that could support Frank. How can we make a copy of this information, or will it be sent? So if you're talking about the slides, you can just make a copy, right? The recording will follow later if you're interested in the recording. And then of course the resource.
Just reshare. Yeah, Shamron just
Okay,
reshared
good.
the slide deck for everybody. So if you want the resources and the slide deck, they are in the chat box right now. You can click on those and open them and save them for yourselves.
Yeah, we also post all of these resources regularly on the project website, so you'll be able to always access the slide decks from all of our webinar presentations. The recordings are also there for you. And then the resource document that we've shared in the chat as well has links to all of the documents that were referenced in today's session. So let us know if there's something in particular that you can't access, Marta, and we'll be happy to email it to you directly.
All right, so next up, our webinar on UDL school implementation criteria. So this is a great webinar, especially if you sit at that leadership level, that you'll find super helpful with UDL implementation. So if you're trying to get into it, begin your journey, if you're trying to sustain it, this would be a good one to look at, because we'll be sharing some resources there. And then of course, as Shamron just mentioned to you before, all of our resources are housed on the website. So you have that there the link there to reference. You'll see here webinars, which this will be there under there, and then top tips and Got a Minute, those follow each webinar. So at some point those will post. I will say we're going through a redesign of our website, so you'll see it'll look a little different if you've been there before, and so we're working through, posting those resources. So you'll see those follow this webinar. Okay. And then lastly, before you go, two things before you provide feedback. So we really would love to hear feedback from you. This helps us get better as we deliver these webinars. But the other thing I want to add is we will be hanging around after this webinar if you have further questions that you may want to ask. So please stick around if you wish. And then also, if you have any questions or want to learn more about UDL and implementation, you can certainly reach out to Shamron, myself, Leah, anyone on this webinar, because we are supporting CCIL, or the CCIL work, which is to support UDL implementation. So yeah. Anything else? Any other questions? So Shamron put the link in the chat. Thank you, Shamron. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Again, if you are sticking around for questions, just stay back and we will answer them the best that we can.